Next on AM 1480 WLEA, the Newsmaker Show. Here's Brian O'Neill.
And back with us on a Thursday, our regular Tuesday guest. I want to have him on and talk about the elections in Israel and some current events and, of course, some history. Dr. Gary Ostrower, thanks for joining us.
Well, it's always good to be here on a Tuesday morning or a Thursday morning, Brian.
Dr. Ostrower, the elections in Israel, there's a lot in that I want to ask you about, including the Facebook interruption. I don't know if that was a technical difficulty or a little editorial move there on Facebook part, where they pulled the Prime Minister's page off. I think it was editorial. I think they complained about the comments that the Likud party was making. But nonetheless, let's get your view on the current situation with the still unfolding election results in Israel.
Well, it's a big question mark, I suppose. Will Netanyahu be the Prime Minister for another, who knows how long? The last time, we had an election 6 months ago. Now we got another election just now. There could be another election in another 6 months, or maybe 2 years, or 3 or 4 years. No one really knows, and it's a very unstable kind of situation. What we do know is that Netanyahu's party, called the Likud Party, received fewer votes and therefore will have fewer members of the Knesset, which is the Israeli parliament, than they had during the last 6 months. And fewer enough so that we simply don't know whether Netanyahu will be able to remain as prime minister. His main opponent, a guy by the name of Gantz, who former army man, former general, who ran on a party called the Blue and White Party, was expected to get fewer votes, fewer members of the Knesset, and he wound up getting either the same number of Knesset members as the Likud, or maybe even one additional. And if he got one additional, it's going to make it very, very difficult for Netanyahu to put together a coalition. Remember, in Israel you have about 8 or 10 different parties, and no one party is going to get a majority, and so you got to, work together with others. But it's going to be very difficult for him to do this now. And in all likelihood, and again, we really don't know, but in all likelihood, he's not going to be able to be the next prime minister. The fellow Gantz is talking about putting together a national coalition party, or a national coalition of sorts that would be a, kind of unity coalition, combining, representatives from many different parties. And there's another fellow who had been a very, very close associate, a very close ally of Netanyahu. His name is Avigdor Lieberman, and Lieberman and Netanyahu split. Lieberman's party controls about 8 or 9 positions in the Knesset right now. Netanyahu can no longer count on them. And consequently, my guess is that eventually these guys are going to put together some kind of a coalition, but it will not include Netanyahu. And, Brian, there's one other kind of interesting thing here, and that is that Netanyahu has been charged with fraud, he's been charged with political corruption, and he may be on trial as early as Monday of this next week. If that's the case, and if he should be convicted, if he is not prime minister, he can be either fined, he could even be put into jail. If he is prime minister, he cannot be sentenced. He can't be, put in jail or fined or whatever. So it's in his own personal interest to remain in power. And by the same token, there are a lot of other people in Israel right now who would love to see him out of power and really punished for, what they see as serious misdeeds.
Netanyahu is conservative, Gary. I guess I would say that. I think I'm correct in saying that. What would you say the politics of the majority in Israel in 2019 are? Left-leaning, right-leaning? What do you think?
Well, it's a hard question to answer. I really don't know the answer to that. And remember, if you had a single party like the Republican Party in the U.S. or the Democratic Party here, you could, say, sure, a little bit, leaning left or leaning right. But Israeli politics is so splintered. So you have a very, very strong, very conservative, very religious right wing, and then you have, a socialist left wing, and then you got a lot of different parties somewhere or another in the middle. Netanyahu had begun, and remember, he's been prime minister in Israel for longer than any other single person has ever held that post. Netanyahu had begun as kind of a center-right candidate. But today he is considered increasingly far-right. And the reason is that he has really thrown in his lot with these, strongly conservative religious parties. And that means not only, is he kind of, conservative in respect to domestic politics vis-a-vis economic issues, but also he has argued again and again and again a real kind of scare scenario, namely that the Arabs are going to take over Israeli politics if they are allowed into one of these governments, if they get more votes, if they get more seats in the Knesset. Well, in this latest election, they have gotten more seats, and I think that a lot of Israelis are simply tiring of this kind of scare tactics. It's like Americans getting tired of Senator McCarthy's claims about communism back in the 1950s. I think that the same thing has been happening in Israel. Something similar, at least, has been happening in Israel, and I think that the Israeli public is tired of it, and that's one of the reasons why, maybe the most important reason why, he did not get a plurality of the votes in this recent election.
Talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower, the Alfred University historian today, I wanted to get back to that point that I brought up in the beginning, Dr. Ostrower. I'm reading here from the Jerusalem Post about the whole Facebook situation. Netanyahu was pulled for a few hours during Election Day this week. And reading here from the Jerusalem Post, jpost.com, Netanyahu's Facebook page has as many followers as Israel's largest TV stations. So when Netanyahu goes live on Facebook, he has a large and loyal audience. And this is me speaking. This is kind of similar to Trump. It says for many years, Netanyahu has tried to bypass the traditional media, which he accuses of being biased against him. And it says that the opponent, Bolsonaro, has pretty much boycotted the mainstream media in Brazil, and Bolsonaro, ran the campaign mostly on social media and ended up winning. Any thoughts there, Gary?
Well, I don't know very much. In fact, I know nothing at all about the degree to which Netanyahu's page went blank on Facebook on their election day. I guess that was 2 days ago. Whether it was a glitch, whether it was a decision by Facebook executives, I mean, I have absolutely no idea as to what's going on there. What I do know is that we live in, and this is in the 21st century, a kind of different political era than you had back in the 20th century. In the 20th century, there were some well-established TV stations and well-established newspapers from which we got most of our information. That's no longer the case. Right now, you have, in other words, the ability of politicians, whether Netanyahu with his Twitter feed or President Trump with his Twitter feed, which, if I'm not mistaken, there are, maybe 50, 60 million people are going to receive his Twitter messages. It means that they have an independent channel to reach the public, and so they're able to essentially attack the more mainstream media and claim that it's, quote, fake news, even if it's not fake news. I mean, we know in our own country, anyone who reads the New York Times knows that the New York Times is anything but fake news. Almost all of their stories are checked and then double-checked and then sometimes triple-checked. Do they make mistakes? Yeah, occasionally they make mistakes. But, 99% of what you're going to read there, not on the editorial page, but on the news pages, is the real thing. The fake news is coming out of the White House, and I think that that's equally true in Israel. The fake news is coming out of Bibi Netanyahu, who is claiming that the Arabs are about to overrun the Israelis and so forth, and therefore we got all these scare tactics. Look, we're going to have to distinguish. People have to be reasonably careful about what they believe. They really ought to go, whether it's Israel or whether it's the United States, to a website like Snopes.com to, check out the veracity of the stories that they are hearing.
This is kind of interesting, Dr. Ostrower. President Trump appeared to distance himself from Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu after the Netanyahu failure to win a parliamentary majority in Tuesday's elections. What is Trump saying? Trump told reporters in California he has not spoken yet with Netanyahu and stressed that his administration's relations are with Israel. The writer of this column says these cool remarks are a blow to Netanyahu, who's fighting for his political survival. What do you make of this?
Well, I think that we know that President Trump is not loyal to anyone outside of members of his own immediate family. So John Bolton, for instance, his last national security advisor, was going to be one of the great national security advisors, my good friend, said Trump, and then, of course, he dumped him. And we can think of about 60 or 70 other people who have been dumped by Trump along the very, very same lines. And I think that with foreign leaders, we see something of the same. So he was very, very close to Netanyahu. These guys were peas in a pod. And now, as of yesterday, Trump is saying, no, my loyalty is not to Netanyahu, it's to Israel. And I don't mean his loyalty per se, but, the friendship with the United States is with Israel. And so, you don't know what to expect from him. But I do think, and I completely agree with you, that this is a real blow to Netanyahu. This certainly is not going to help him, even with members of his own political party, the Likud. So, stay tuned, but President Trump is going to pursue his own interests, not that of Bibi Netanyahu.
This is kind of an interesting development, Dr. Ostrower. We're moving on to Guantanamo Bay issue. President Trump was boarding Air Force One. He was questioned by some reporters about the cost of detaining prisoners at Guantanamo Bay. And Trump said, and this is a departure from other conservatives, I think it's crazy. It costs a fortune to operate it. I think it's crazy. We're looking into, what is he looking into? Keeping it open possibly, but he previously has been an advocate for it, but now it sounds like he's kind of changing his tune.
Well, he certainly wasn't changing his tune during the election of 2016. But, I suppose he's changing his tune. I have not read that particular article, so I haven't, seen his most recent comments. But, Trump is well known for changing his position. And let's take a look, not at Guantanamo, but what happened with the strike on the Saudi oil refineries just within the past 48 hours. 48 hours ago, Trump said after the news was received that the Houthis, that is the rebels in Yemen, had flown some drones and maybe even sent cruise missiles into the oil refinery, knocking out one half of Saudi oil production. Trump's first comment was that, look, the Iranians are responsible. We are locked and loaded. In other words, he's suggesting that he's going to, order some kind of a military strike on Iran as punishment for what happened in Saudi Arabia. Yesterday, he really says something quite different. He's arguing that no, we want to find some kind of a perhaps, peaceful settlement of this whole thing. And when Senator Lindsey Graham said, look, we have no choice but to send the Iranians a message, and that message must be a military message, Trump backed away from that. So, what he says one day, we don't, he may or may not be saying the very, very same thing the next day. He's erratic. He's unpredictable. He's impulsive. And that does not bode well for a person who's making foreign policy. On the other hand, when it comes to Guantanamo, I think there are very few prisoners in Guantanamo. We just have a few of those prisoners who were left from 2001, and to my knowledge, at least, no one else has been placed into that place. Does it make economic sense to keep it open? I think the answer is certainly no, it does not. We have plenty of other alternatives.
If I could stop you there, Dr. Ostrower, does it make sense to throw buckets of water in prisoners' faces in 2019 when you have all this monitoring of emails and texts and phone calls?
Well, I think, Brian, to ask the question is to answer the question. Of course it does not. But, be it as it may, I don't know what what President Trump is going to argue about Guantanamo in 2 weeks or 3 weeks. What I do know is that we don't know what he's going to say. He says we're going to have background checks when it comes to guns, and then he says, after talking to the head of the NRA after a phone call from this fellow, no, we're really not looking at background checks. You tell me what he really believes. I certainly don't know what he believes. And you called him a conservative. I don't think he's a conservative at all. I think that he's really quite unpredictable. I mean, he was a supporter of Hillary Clinton when she was senator of New York, and then, of course, he was running against her as president. He supported pro-choice positions in respect to abortion when he was living in New York, and then he ran for president, and now he's saying just the opposite. So, what does he really believe? Big question mark in my estimation. Brian, I do want to say, I want to turn, if I may, to one other issue that I think is worth mentioning before we talk about this day in history. And that is that President Trump has just essentially told the Californians, who have fairly strict emissions control. I'm talking about, pollution emissions control as part of the effort to clean up their air. He's just told them that they are not going to be permitted to impose strict controls in respect to the number of miles per gallon that cars must achieve. The Californians are seeking, and I don't know how long this will take, but they're seeking a standard. That would mean that the average car, constructed in, manufactured in, maybe 2030, I really don't know what the year is, would have to have gas efficiency of 54 miles per gallon, of approximately 54 miles per gallon. The federal standard is much lower than that. It's 37 miles per gallon. And what Trump is telling the Californians is that they cannot impose create, if you will, those higher emission standards. And to me, this is it makes no sense whatsoever. We should be cleaning up our environment. We should be cleaning up all the plastic we're putting into the Atlantic Pacific Ocean. And we certainly should be cleaning up our air, consistent with the Clean Air Act of 1970 and 1971. And President Trump is pulling the rug out from these kinds of standards, and it's our children, not us, but our children who are going to have to face the consequences of this.
Going to take a quick break talking to Dr. Gary Ostrower. This Day in History is next.
Selecting a nursing home for a loved one isn't easy until you've discovered Hornell Gardens Nursing and Rehabilitation. Hornell Gardens delivers the highest level of care, compassion, and commitment with amenities and activities that will enrich body, mind, and spirit. It's a place that's close to home. Stop in for a tour of Hornell Gardens, located at 434 Monroe Avenue in Hornell, or to learn more, call 585-222-CARE or visit hurlbutcare.com.
Checking in now with meteorologist Rob Carrollin, who says it's going to be pretty sunny today.
That's right, Brian. Our stretch of sunny weather continues, though right now we've got some cloudiness overhead. It's actually a sign of warmer weather moving in aloft. Brian, warm air is lighter than cool air, has the tendency to rise up over the top of it, and that's what's producing that band of cloudiness we can see. That stretches for a couple hundred miles from Ontario across the central part of Lake Ontario through west central and central New York State all the way down to the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia this morning. These clouds will be lifting off towards the north and east, and behind it we'll see warmer temperatures for Friday and the weekend. We're going to turn sunny today. We'll find our highs 70 to 75 this afternoon. Sunrise this morning was at 6:55. The sun will set tonight at 7:13. We have clear weather in the forecast for the overnight, though there may be some patchy fog around. Overnight lows 45 to 50. Tomorrow, sunny, warmer, 70 to 75 by noon, and I think we hit 75 to 80 for the high tomorrow afternoon. We're clear, not as cool tomorrow night, 50 to 55. Sun for Saturday, 75 to 80, and we look partly sunny and 80 to 85 for Sunday, Brian.
Thank you, Rob. Back with Dr. Gary Ostrower, This Day in History. September 19th, 1969, President Nixon canceled the draft calls for November and December. Nixon announces the cancellation of the draft calls for November and December, reducing the draft call by 50,000, by 32,000 in November, and by 18,000 in December. This move is accompanied by his twin program of turning the war over to the South Vietnamese with U.S. troop withdrawals. And he did this, they say, at the History Channel, which is where I get this, in order to calm down the anti-war protests. Dr. Ostrower.
Well, it succeeded. It did calm down the anti-war protest. And it wasn't simply eliminating the draft call for November and December. That was followed up, as you may or may not remember. Well, you probably are too young to remember, but certainly I'm old enough. He eventually, we eliminated the draft altogether. So during the Vietnam War, beginning in 1960, those soldiers who were fighting in Vietnam were either volunteers, many of them into the Army, but even more of those in other services like the Navy and certainly the Marines, the Air Force. But the bulk of the soldiers after 1965, and I say 1965 because it was in that year, it was in July of that year, that the United States government really Americanized the Vietnam War. Until July of 1965, most of the soldiers there were South Vietnamese soldiers. The Americans were there in advisory positions and a little bit of search and a little bit of destroy, but for the most part the numbers were relatively modest. After July 1965, President Johnson called for an increase of 75,000 American troops. The next year, an additional 75 to 100,000 American troops. And by 1968, there were over 500,000 American GIs in Vietnam. By the same token, as those numbers increased, protest against the war increased here at home. And much of that protest was led by college students who knew that once they graduated, they were going to be subject to the draft. And so Nixon and his Secretary of State Kissinger had made the decision in 1969 to do two things. Number one, to essentially de-escalate, to Vietnamize the war. In other words, to reduce the number of American troops and to, allow the South Vietnamese to carry the war against the North. And secondly, and as part of that, to eliminate the draft. And when they eliminated the draft, they really did eliminate most popular protests against the war. And that draft has not been reinstituted, and that's in part because the Department of Defense knows, every president since then has known, that if you have a professional army, if you have an all-volunteer army, you're much less likely to have popular opposition to any war. And that remains true even today. I mean, we're now involved in Afghanistan for 18 years. It's an unsuccessful war. It's an unpopular war, and yet there's been very, very little popular protest. Brian, I think one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons for that is the fact that there is no draft.
Dr. Osterauer, a question occurred to me. When I was in college in the late 1980s in Alfred, there was kind of a stereotype that the university had more liberal students and the state had more conservative students. Now let's go back to 1969, Alfred State 1969, Alfred University 1969, Vietnam War time period. Was that true then?
No, it was not true then. And I think the reason it was not true is because of what we noted before. The existence of the draft really turned an entire college generation. I'm talking about that generation coming of age in the late 1960s against the war. At Alfred University, liberals, conservatives, Republicans, Democrats. In 1968, after the Kent State killings, there were popular protests. 400 colleges went on strike, including those at Alfred University, and that strike included, I would say, probably had support from 90 or maybe even more than 90% of the students here. And as I say, that's regardless of political party.
How about the state college?
Well, I know, not being connected with the state college, I can't say exactly the same thing, but I have no reason to believe that state students who also faced the draft were any more enthusiastic about the Vietnam War than were students at Alfred University. So I really think that this is a generational thing. I think this cuts across party lines. Look, Kent State University was it is a state school. And yet we know about the protests there that led to the murders, the killings, if you will, of 4 Kent State students. We know what happened at Jackson State, again, a state college down in Mississippi. I really don't think it has much to do with whether or not the students came are at a state college or at a private college. I think it cut across all economic lines, upper class students, middle class students, lower class students. Very, very few of them wanted to fight in Vietnam. Very, very few of them were enthusiastic about the draft.
We've been talking to Alfred State history professor Dr. Gary Ostrower. Out of time. Glad I asked that last question. That was a very interesting and, as always, a very interesting show. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Ostrower.
My pleasure. Have a good weekend.